For this episode of Scholar Talks, we will be discussing the principles and meaning of the Declaration of Independence. Our guest, Matthew Spalding, is a Kirby Professor of Government at Hillsdale College and its Dean of the Van Andel School of Government in Washington, D.C. He is the author and editor of several books on the American founding, excellent books, I might add, including We Still Hold These Truths, also A Sacred Union of Citizen, Washington's Farewell Address, and The American Character. And his newest book, The Making of the American Mind, the story of our Declaration of Independence, which is, of course, the topic of today's discussion. I am Tony Williams, Senior Fellow at the Bill of Rights Institute, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Scholar Talks in our America 250 series. Matt, I want to thank you very much for joining me.
Great to be with you, Tony.
Yeah, great. I really love the book. What a great combination of telling a really great story, but then also understanding the meaning, the principles, the ideas that went into the making of the Declaration of Independence. And I might add, maybe just maybe why it's still important today
Right.
and still has a great deal of relevance going forward.
No, I wanted to do something different. On the assumption there were going to be lots of books out on the 250th. I wanted to let the Declaration, if you will, tell its own story. We often study the document by just studying Jefferson or just studying a particular thing or looking at one aspect of it. I basically wanted to kind of lay out a full story of how it came into being, and then walk through it very carefully. I mean, we oftentimes focus on the famous, very important parts of the Declaration, but we oftentimes ignore the rest of it. And so I wanted to do an overarching treatment, if you will, so looking at the Declaration, kind of treating it as a symphony of different parts, but all in harmony. So that I would kind of draw the reader in with the story. It's actually a very fascinating, dynamic story.
Mhm.
But then once they get into it, start seeing and working through the Declaration, its components, and explain them because these were all live questions. They were all debated at great length. This is what they were arguing about in all their pamphlets. This is not some sort of invention out of some philosophical mind. This is what, as Jefferson said, which the title of the book comes from. He said it was meant to be an expression of the American mind, and that's how I approach it.
Great. Well, objectives achieved. So let's dive in and talk about it. So can you provide a little bit of historical background, set the stage, some of the events that led to American independence?
Yeah, without necessarily going into too much detail that everybody is hearing a lot about. I would note a few things that make the set up the Declaration perhaps a little bit differently than we might look at, because I'm trying to center my narrative on Independence Hall in Philadelphia in the
Mhm.
Continental Congress. Continental Congress had already met once in 1774. They had already issued their grievances to the King of England. There are various documents that had done so, but the Continental Congress comes together for the first time as a Congress, which is a unique use of that term. And they decide that, well, if nothing happens, we will meet again. Well, nothing did happen, but something unfortunate or bad or tragic happened, I suppose, which was right before the Second Continental Congress. General Gage in Boston sent troops out to look for stores of hidden munitions. And we had Lexington Concord just a few weeks before the Second Continental Congress. So that was kind of the immediate precursor. The Continental Congress comes together. There's a very intense debate what to do. Sometimes we forget, and we have, in hindsight, since we know what happened, we don't quite think about it this way. But you try to put yourself in their shoes. Are we going to war or not? Do we want to go to war? We really don't, but what's going to happen here? We really do not know. Lexington Concord triggers a overall continental defense mechanism to start the kind of into place. Um, but then come June of 1775, once they decide we're going to have to defend ourselves, and we will recognize this army around Boston, these militias around Boston as a Continental Army, and then they appoint George Washington as a general, which itself is an act of war. At that point, you had Bunker Hill, and once you have Bunker Hill, you've got a war. So it happens very rapidly, moves very rapidly, and to some extent, I put the Declaration in the context of the events. You know, often we study the Declaration as a separate document by itself, as opposed to recognizing that it was actually a political document. It was a piece of legislation passed by the Continental Congress, and proclaimed by the Continental Congress. It had a committee, a subcommittee. It was heavily edited by the committee, and then it was heavily edited again by the Continental Congress. And so the kind of the legislative dynamic of that debate about independence, and then separately about the Declaration itself, is a lot of the setup, if you will, the circumstances in the book.
Sure, great. So, and you also, besides this confluence of events, you also describe a confluence of ideas as well. So you explain the different influences on the founders. So how do ancient thinkers and the English tradition and the Enlightenment, Protestant Christianity, all these different strains of thought, all these different influences, kind of influence the Declaration of Independence?
Just a short, brief question there.
Yeah, just
Um,
in a nutshell.
yeah, well, I mean, I would generally say, by again backing it up and looking at it more broadly, oftentimes we think of the Declaration, well, that means we should just study Jefferson. And Jefferson is important, don't get me wrong.
Mhm.
But the Continental Congress as a whole really debated and edited and shaped this thing. So the question is, what were the influences on the overall Congress? And so I actually spent a lot of time in the book uh, placing it in its historical context. You know, the Declaration begins when in the course of human events, which is a historical reference. How do they understand history? And they really understood it in a very traditional way, but that also placed them within a history, and they very much understood that. So I look at those influences, if you will, to try to draw out those influences in ways that others have talked about, but I've tried to kind of pull it together very tightly. Um, and in putting the book together, one thing I did come to the conclusion, even more than I previously thought, was the influence of, say, Cicero in particular, but the Romans and the classical thinking. The classical education was the dominant form at the time. They had clearly been influenced by that. Cicero tended to be what they read when they learned Latin. And the teachers, which were largely from Scottish Presbyterians, came over and ran the schools where these guys were taught, were largely classical scholars. The British tradition is extremely important, the common law tradition, and I talk about that at great length, Blackstone and Cook in particular. But of course, then broadly, the whole Christian tradition. Again, something I always thought was very important, but even more so, I think, you know, as in spending some time in thinking this through, is how the Christian tradition, for all intents and purposes, becomes the bridge, if you will, that brings the classical tradition, meaning the thinking about nature and kind of the philosophical groundings of what man is.
Mhm.
The Christian tradition shapes that, but also then brings it into the modern era and brings it in and greatly shapes the American founders, especially through the thinkers like Hooker, and others. So the point is, there's all of these things. Again, don't think of the Declaration out of context. All of these things are percolating up in all of their pamphlets, all of their writings. It's being quoted, it's being talked about at great length, and it's being debated in the Continental Congress. So when Jefferson writes the Declaration, he's pulling it all together. You know, there's a famous letter, which I know you're familiar with, where he refers to the Declaration being grounded in what Aristotle, Cicero, Sidney, and Locke, etc. Of course, that etc. is very important, but generally
Right.
speaking, he was thinking in those philosophical terms in terms of what he was doing, but it wasn't Jefferson inserting those. That was the coin of the day. They were debating these things. Um,
Right. Yeah. And I was just going to say, what I love is that, you talk about them not being abstract theorists, right? They weren't professors sitting around in a
right.
seminar room with graduate students. I mean, they were practical statesmen. I love that you brought that out there. They're practical statesmen deploying this harmonizing sentiments of the day, all these ideas into their arguments for liberty and self-government.
Right, right. No, I think that's very important. We look for philosophical consistency, and as a result, we tend to emphasize outside philosophical thinkers. Locke is the greatest example of that. Locke was important. I don't downplay Locke, but I don't think it's right to then say they were quote unquote Lockeans. They weren't political philosophy students. They used what they had at hand, and they had all of these influences. And Jefferson pulls it together very, very wonderfully and beautifully in his writing. These harmonizing sentiments, but they harmonize them. That's very important. One of the things I emphasize in the book, in the middle of the Declaration, there's a long conversation about prudence, and prudence is the virtue of it's a political virtue. It's the virtue of the statesman, which relates abstract principles to practical circumstances. That's clearly what they were doing.
Mhm. Right. And so speaking of one of those abstract principles, so you talk a lot about natural law. So what is natural law and how does it shape the Declaration of Independence?
Yeah, that's an important question. It really goes back to the kind of the tradition shaping their thinking coming into the Declaration, if you will. Although there's some immediate references in the Declaration itself, the laws of nature, of nature's God, for instance. But part of it is to understand the tradition, if you will. I mean, the Greeks begin discussions about nature. The Romans and Cicero, you get the beginnings of what is actually called natural law. So it really is pre-Christian for that matter. But then, especially in the Christian tradition, Aquinas in particular, and others, you get this development of this concept of natural law. Now, don't think it is some kind of crazy academic add-on, but this was the way to think about man and creation and the political world around him, which say there's a nature of things. Man has reason and can understand it, and because of that, can understand certain principles, certain what the Declaration would call self-evident truths, and reason from that to conclusions. And the phrasing they used for those truths by nature was natural law. Those were laws. Now you can think about it in a Christian sense that those were laws are promulgated by God, and we understand them by either formal revelation or general revelation, which is through our reason, or you can understand it in a classical Greek or Roman sense, just rational thinking about the nature of things. But that language is just throughout their education, and more importantly, it's throughout their pamphlets, and it's very clear they're drawing that in. And this, of course, gets us to the Locke question. Locke, again, is very significant, as is Algernon Sidney, by the way. Both of them talk about natural law. They also talk about natural right. There's some different language additions in the modern era. That I recognize that. But the question then is, in my mind, is not what John Locke thought, although that's a very important, interesting question. It's what did the American founders think of John Locke? How do they use John Locke? Where do they put John Locke in their pantheon, if you will? And I argue that they understood John Locke and Sidney, for that matter, in the longer tradition, which was a natural law tradition, going back to the Greeks and the Romans, also heavily influenced by Christianity. It's no coincidence, for instance, that the vast majority of the references to Locke in the American founding era are found in sermons. They essentially read the Christian Locke, the surface Locke, the two treatises Locke. They didn't read the philosophical Locke because they're not philosophers. They're not political philosophers. They're practical statesmen. They're trying to build a regime.
Right. Excellent. So you mentioned self-evident truths and how that flows from the natural law. So you say that the Declaration has five self-evident truths. I love the way you frame that up. It really lays it out nicely. So what are those five self-evident truths and why are they significant?
Well, the general flow of the document is very significant. There's the famous second paragraph that begins, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." I always like to point out, by the way, that they didn't say, "We have some opinions we'd like to share with you." They actually start talking about truths, which is very important, and truths that are self-evident. Now, we oftentimes think of self-evidence, that concept being a modern idea, and it's used in modern thinking. But the most famous use of the concept of self-evident is in Thomas Aquinas, and it really goes back to Aristotle, who got it from kind of logical mathematicians. So it's an older idea, which you can that is, the mind can understand things. And so it is this kind of connected back to this natural law tradition. But then I map out in the book the five truths, because it's Jefferson is a student of rhetoric, so he's very good at this. We all these truths we self-evident that, and the word that signals that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that governments are based on consent of the governed, and that if government does not secure these rights, the people have a right to alter, abolish it, and institute new government. So I just got to, if you look at the document and the way it's written and look at it closely and how it's structured, he's very careful with words. There's lots of signaling as to how it's organized in terms of a legal brief, if you will. I mean, it states principles, then we go through prudence to figure out what to do, and then it comes to a conclusion in the end.
Mhm. Excellent. Yeah, you just make it so easy to understand, for the average American citizen. So I love it. So you just meant we just talked about the self-evident truths. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. Like most of us, or at least we should, but we do know that second paragraph of the Declaration. But we often forget the list of grievances, and you spend a good amount of time there, and I love that. So what's important about this often neglected list of grievances against the king?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's extremely important. It's the longest section of the whole document for sure. It was the one that was most amended and debated at the Continental Congress, and it was the one that the British, especially the King's men, if you will, and the loyalists in America, spent most of their time responding to. So at the time, it was the crucial piece. The famous second paragraph, which we now all know, it was a core statement of their beliefs, and had that philosophical meaning at the beginning. It was always there. But at the time, it was somewhat taken for granted is too hard of a phrase, I guess. But it was kind of that was part of them. They had assumed that, and so the focus really was on the grievances.
Mm.
And if you think about it as a legal case, here's what we believe. Here's what we've kind of stated our principles. And they're going to conclude later that the king is a tyrant. But really, as you would expect in a courtroom, what's the meat of the argument is going through your evidence. And that's what the grievances are. So I do spend a lot of time on that. And what I do is I try to find this. This actually is probably the longest part of my research, because as with all of us, right, we don't study that stuff as much. What do they mean? There are a whole bunch of them. There are 20 some, 27, or I can't remember the number. Um, they don't seem to be in a pattern. There's not an obvious references. There's no dating. They don't seem to be in a particular order. And so I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what each one of them meant and where each one of them came from, and then what was the
Mhm.
pattern. And what I came up with was that it actually does follow a pattern if you break it down into its sections, meaning how it's based on how it's written, which is the first part is about the king's abuses of power. What was the king doing to abuse his own power
Mhm.
against the Americans? And then there's a section on the king's usurpations, which is the stuff we might more famously recognize, because this is where the king has usurped Americans' power by allowing Parliament to rule us. And so here are
Mhm.
references to basically all the laws that Parliament passed that we object to. And then the last part of the grievances is about the king's out and out violations of kind of the use of power to destroy the Americans, to go to war with his own people, which famously talks about the Hessians and impressing Americans in the British Navy, culminating in the fact that he's a tyrant. And he's anyway. So I think there is a pattern if you look at it and see how it was constructed and debated. It's extremely important. It really is the meat of the matter. And it also shows you very nicely their practical statesman-like thinking about the particulars, because how you understand the particulars and how they tie back to violations of the principles is extremely important.
It's magnificent. I'm just thinking, I've read it, I don't know how many times in my life, but and taught it and thought about it and written about it for BRI and in my books. And yet, you've given me a new way to look at it. So,
Good,
you
good.
learn
Well, then I've done my job.
Yeah. So you call the final part of the Declaration its closing argument, and this is what I really love, and it is basically a quote that the colonists saw themselves as a people, as a nation, and as fellow citizens. I thought that was a really magnificent way to put it. Can you please explain your understanding of that?
Yeah, well, part of that is, I'm going through the Declaration. There's been this long section on grievances, and then the very last paragraph is actually pretty straightforward. We therefore the representatives, it's the formal statement of their independence. At the end of which they famously pledge to each other the lives, their fortune, and sacred honor. A very beautiful price, the most beautiful line in the Declaration. But it took me a while to figure out. There's this short paragraph in between there, and I couldn't for a while figure out why was it there. Jefferson doesn't waste words. The Continental Congress cut it back by 25 to 30%. And they're the worthless words are not there. It's always being tightened. Why was that section there? It famously talks about our British brethren.
Right.
And I concluded is that it was not actually intended to be about the British per se, but it was actually intended to be about us.
Hmm.
And the Declaration begins by, when in the course of human events, one people is interesting as well, because the Declaration assumes we are already a people.
Mhm.
It's already there. And so at the end of the Declaration, they then come back to this question of a people. The British are our brethren, which say we're related to them. They're our ancestors. They are literally our brethren, our fathers, our uncles. We are related to them. That will continue. Enemies in war, in peace, friends. Um, but the British are not referred to as a people. The
Mhm.
Americans are a people. And that struck me as very important, and I dug into that and found that throughout their writings, throughout the writings of the Continental Congress, the Americans are always a people, and the British are not a people. They're subjects, they're brethren, but it's something different. So you have to understand the extent to which the Declaration assumes an argument about what it means to be a people. It has something to do with place. It has something to do with circumstances and common sufferings, as Jay says in Federalist 2. But it ultimately has something to do with what are the things we hold in common and around which we are going to build our regime. And that's actually what the Declaration is a statement of those things by which we are a people. And
Mhm.
by extension, those things mean that the British are not a people in that sense because they're subjects. Indeed, the Declaration says they are deaf. They are deaf to our claim of rights because they don't understand them because they are not self-governing individuals. So
Right.
I think the people and the people then becoming citizens, and that kind of really begins in the Declaration, this idea of citizen. But of course, that's not formalized until later, once we get state constitutions are formed, and then eventually the federal constitution.
Right. Excellent. So, as we wrap up here, early in the book, you describe the Declaration as a severance in the relationship of Great Britain. I mean, it's declaring independence, but you say it's much more than that. So, more importantly, you call it the quote, the defining statement of America's meaning and purpose. So, as we wrap up, uh, in a nutshell, what is that meaning and purpose?
No- Nothing's in a nutshell.
Right, right.
Well, one thing is it always struck me again, going through the Declaration, and I encourage everyone to read it again. We've read it millions of times, but read it again carefully and slowly. Throughout the Declaration, there are I think three or four places where they talk about their independence, but it's always presented in a twofold way, which is that they are severing themselves from the British and creating a new government. They have a right to alter, abolish, and begin a new government. It's always a twofold expression. It's never merely a breaking down. It's not revolutionary in that sense. Um, so there's always this other side, and which is why, by the way, I like to refer to it as the American founding as opposed to the American Revolution, although it was a revolution in its own way. But it goes to this other question about what were they ultimately trying to do, and I think they were ultimately trying to lay the groundwork for a much larger and bigger a nation, a country, a regime. But it was a regime based on a new way of thinking, a new set of principles, which is why it's radical in the sense of going back to the root. And those new principles would be the ground for a future government, which they didn't have yet, which later takes us to the Constitution. And in that sense, it's very clear, especially if you read, Hancock said this to when he sent a letter out to the all the other colonies about the Declaration. It's meant to be the thing around which we are going to build a nation. So it's a statement of principle. And then if you start thinking about that, so it doesn't, so when we say we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that's not just the grounds upon which we're going to sever ourselves from England because they denied our rights. It's saying we're going to build a nation on those principles, that all men are created equal, they're endowed with rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, consent. So that those then become the principles upon which American government is going to be built. And so the Declaration, the Constitution are kind of two sides of the same coin. They always have to be. They always were historically, and they always have to be going forward. You can't have a constitution unless you have the precursor ideas behind it. And that is extremely important. In ancient thinking and in Plato's laws in particular, there's a reference to before the law you have to have the precursors of the law, a prior philosophical statement behind the law. And I think that's what the Declaration is, and I think that's what they understood it to be.
Beautifully said. Beautifully said. Here, I agree. So, Matt, a delightful conversation. Thank you so much,
Nice
and
talking to
just
you.
thank you for joining me to discuss the Declaration of Independence. So important, so relevant today as we celebrate America 250. It always has been very important in our American creed, but also hopefully for the next 250 years.
No, thank you for that. Thank you for the conversation. Thank you for your nice words about the book. And thank you for all your work, by the way, as well.
Well, thank you. We're doing a few good things over at BRI too, so that's great. Thanks. All right, so
Thanks.
thank you all for joining us as well on this episode of Scholar Talks. Please check out the other episodes of Scholar Talks in the America 250 series on our channel and click subscribe. Thanks.